Okay, so you want to build the most beautiful bridge in the world. You want the towers that scrape the fog, the orange steel that photographs better than anything else humans have built. The postcard every visitor to San Francisco buys before they've even left the airport. You think about the engineering, the record-breaking span, the ribbon cutting. Very few people think about the payroll, the paint, the bonds, and the bill that was still being paid off nearly 90 years later. Here is the number that puts all of it in perspective. The bridge cost $35 million to build in 1937. Since then, the Golden Gate Bridge, Highway and Transportation District is spending, or has already committed more than $3 billion just to keep it standing and keep people alive on it. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story compressed into one number. So here is the question nobody asks cleanly. What does it actually cost to own a bridge forever? The answer is not what most people expect, and once you understand it, you will see America's most photographed piece of infrastructure in a completely different light. It starts with a $35 million bet, placed in the middle of the worst economic collapse in American history. But before we can understand what the Golden Gate Bridge actually cost, we need to understand the desperate economic logic that convinced anyone to build it at all. Before we understand the Golden Gate Bridge, we need to understand the isolation that created the hunger for it. In the 1920s, San Francisco was a peninsula acting like an island. Marin County and the North Bay were a ferry ride away. 20 to 30 minutes across cold, current-heavy water, on boats that could not run in fog or in the storms that regularly closed the strait. Every car, every farmer's truck of produce, every commuter had to queue for a crossing controlled by a private ferry company that had no incentive to build anything better. The ferries were working exactly as designed. That was the problem. Then came the idea that changed the calculation: a self-liquidating bond. Instead of asking the state or federal government to pay for the bridge, a new special district, spanning 6 counties, would sell $35 million in construction bonds directly to investors, backed not by tax revenue, but by the tolls the bridge itself would someday collect. The bridge would, in theory, pay for its own existence. It was an elegant solution to a real problem. It was also, structurally, a promise that the users of a bridge that did not yet exist would cover its costs for as long as the bridge stood. A promise nobody in 1930 could actually calculate the size of. The first test of that promise came almost immediately. Voters approved the bond in November 1930, 1 year after the stock market crash, by a margin of roughly 3-1, a striking vote of confidence from 6 counties in the depth of the Great Depression. But confidence didn't sell bonds. Wall Street, still reeling, wanted nothing to do with a $35 million construction project backed by a bridge that existed only on paper. The bonds sat unsold for 2 years. It took Amedeo Giannini, founder of Bank of America, personally agreeing to buy the entire issue in 1932 to get shovels into the ground. Construction began on January 5, 1933. Here is the part that gets lost in the postcard version of the story. This was never really a bridge-building project. It was a bet that toll revenue, collected nickel by nickel from commuters for decades, would eventually cover a debt that private capital markets had just refused to touch. Everything that came afterward, every dollar spent, saved, or scrambled for, flows from that single structural decision. Debt alone doesn't explain what the Golden Gate Bridge became. Here is where the math gets uncomfortable. Let's run the actual numbers, because they are almost impossible to comprehend once you stack them properly. Layer 1, the input cost. Chief engineer Joseph Strauss had originally pitched a bridge for as little as $17 million. Rival estimates from skeptical engineers ran as high as $100 million. The final approved bond was $35 million, and construction actually came in $1.3 million under that, finishing in April 1937 after 4 years of work. Using the wage of an unskilled Depression-era laborer, roughly 50 cents an hour, as the conversion anchor, that $35 million represented tens of millions of labor hours at a time when a quarter of San Francisco's workforce had no job at all. The Golden Gate Bridge was, among other things, one of the largest employment programs the Bay Area had ever seen. Layer 2, the ongoing cost. This is where the surprise usually lives, and the Golden Gate Bridge is no exception. A steel suspension bridge sitting directly in a saltwater fog belt does not merely need occasional touch-ups. It requires continuous, permanent, uninterrupted painting. An in-house crew whose sole, unending job since 1937 has been coating roughly 1.7 miles of exposed steel in international orange before corrosion gets there first. There is no year in which this line item drops to zero. It is not a maintenance expense in the ordinary sense. It is a standing payroll obligation baked into the bridge's existence, permanently, for as long as the bridge exists. Layer 3. The hidden cost. Nobody in 1930 budgeted for earthquake codes that did not yet exist, or for a public health crisis that would not become an engineering line item for 87 years. But both arrived. In 1996, 7 years after the Loma Prieta earthquake exposed how differently a modern engineer would build the same structure, the district began a seismic retrofit program that is still running today. Its final phase alone, carrying a price tag of roughly $1.8 billion. Only about half of it currently secured through federal and state grants. Separately, a suicide prevention net project approved in 2014 at an estimated $76 million was finally completed a decade later, for $224 million, nearly 3 times the original estimate. Neither of these costs appears anywhere in the 1930 bond prospectus. Both were, in hindsight, inevitable. Let's zoom out. The total cost of building the Golden Gate Bridge, in nominal dollars, was $33.7 million. Engineers at the district itself have estimated that building the same bridge today, using 2003-era construction costs, would run around $1.2 billion, before adjusting further for today's prices. Read that again. The single largest capital project in the bridge's history is not the bridge. It is the seismic retrofit currently being paid for by the bridge's own toll revenue, 90 years after the ribbon was cut. The numbers were working. Then the promise the bridge was built on started to show its cracks. The one nobody at the ribbon cutting had priced in. Here is the structural problem with the self-liquidating financial model that nobody in the 1930s fully solved. A bridge financed entirely by its own future users, with no tax backstop, is only as strong as the assumption that future revenue will always outpace whatever the future decides to demand of it. And a bridge, unlike a bond, does not get to renegotiate what it owes the world. Every safety standard invented after 1937, every seismic code rewritten after every subsequent earthquake, every crisis discovered decades later becomes a bill the toll booth has to somehow cover, with no ceiling and no expiration date. That flaw showed up first not in the balance sheet, but on the construction site itself. Bridge building in the 1930s operated on a grim industry rule of thumb, roughly 1 worker death for every $1 million spent. On a $35 million project, that math predicted around 35 fatalities. Strauss, over considerable objection from cost-conscious backers, spent $130,000, a genuinely large sum in the middle of the Depression, on a safety net slung beneath the roadway, 10 feet wider than the bridge itself. It caught 19 men who fell during construction and lived to found an informal club, the Halfway to Hell Club, named for the joke that a worker who died had gone to hell, while a worker caught by the net had only gone halfway. For most of construction, it worked spectacularly. Only 1 man had died by February 1937. Then came February 17, 1937. A stripping platform being used to remove wooden scaffolding under the roadway broke loose near the south end of the bridge, tearing through the net that had protected the project for 4 years, and plunging 12 men into water 67 feet below. 2 survived, pulled out by a passing crab boat. 10 did not. In a single afternoon, the project's fatality count went from 1 to 11. Still less than a third of what the industry's own grim formula predicted, and still fewer deaths than either the Bay Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge. But a brutal, sudden reminder that even the era's most celebrated safety investment had a breaking point nobody had engineered for. The wider lesson sat underneath that one afternoon, rather than inside it. A financing model built on the idea that a bridge could absorb any future cost, forever, without a plan for the unplanned, had already met its first unplanned cost before the bridge had even opened to traffic. The bill for building fast and financing forever had been deferred as long as it could be. What came next wasn't a surprise. It was arithmetic, decades late. By the time the reckoning fully arrived, the number attached to it was not measured in millions anymore. It was measured in billions, spread across 3 separate emergencies that the 1930 bond prospectus never once mentioned. First consequence. The debt itself survived, barely. Depression-era traffic came in below projections for years, squeezing the toll revenue the entire structure depended on. The district held the line through toll increases and relentless cost discipline, and the original $35 million bond issue, the one Wall Street wouldn't touch in 1930, was finally retired in full, with interest, in 1971. Not a single tax dollar had gone into building it. That was the promise, and on paper it was kept. Second consequence. Keeping that promise meant every subsequent shock landed on the same toll booth. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake revealed that a bridge engineered to 1930s standards could not be assumed safe under modern seismic codes, and the district began a retrofit program in 1996 that has now run for 3 decades across multiple phases. The current and largest of them alone budgeted at roughly $1.8 billion, financed through a patchwork of federal grants, state highway funds, and the district's own toll reserves, because there was never any other pool of money the bridge was allowed to draw from. Third consequence, and the longest tail of all, the human cost that had been building quietly since 1937. Close to 2,000 people had died by suicide from the bridge by the time officials finally approved a physical barrier in 2014. 10 years and 1 lawsuit between contractors and the district later, a stainless steel net was completed in January 2024 for $224 million, over $148 million more than budgeted, and cut confirmed suicides from an annual average of 30 down to 14 in its first full year. The delay had been financial and political for decades. The final bill, when it came, dwarfed the entire original safety budget of the bridge's construction by nearly 2,000 times over. What replaced the old model was not a new financing structure so much as a permanent one, an infrastructure district that now exists, essentially forever, to absorb whatever the next 50 years decide the bridge owes. Earthquake codes not yet written, mental health infrastructure not yet imagined, corrosion science not yet discovered, funded entirely by whoever happens to be driving across it that decade. The bridge that was supposed to pay for itself once has instead learned to pay for itself continuously, in perpetuity, against bills nobody in 1937 could have itemized. Here is the honest ledger of the Golden Gate Bridge. On the asset side, it connected a region, was built without a single tax dollar, finished under budget, retired its own debt in full, and maintained a construction safety record well ahead of its era's grim industry standard. On the liability side, the financing model that made all of that possible also committed every future generation of toll payers to an open-ended bill. A bill that, 90 years later, now runs into the billions and shows no sign of a final invoice. The Golden Gate Bridge was not produced by a uniquely reckless era or a handful of short-sighted engineers. It was produced by incentives. A self-liquidating bond rewards getting something built and opened as cheaply and quickly as the market will allow, and it has no mechanism for pricing in the seismic code, the mental health crisis, or the corrosion problem that the next 90 years will invent. Each step was rational, given the incentives in front of it. Each step quietly transferred the cost of that rationality onto people who hadn't been born yet. So the next time you hear that a piece of public infrastructure will pay for itself through the fees, tolls, or usage charges of its future users, you are not looking at something new. You are looking at something very, very old. The Golden Gate Bridge proved the concept, and it is still sending the bill. What happens to a self-liquidating promise when the thing it was built to cover turns out to be the smallest part of what it eventually owes?